Well, good afternoon, Facebook Live. I'm Brad Bodis. Welcome to our weekly Bond and Bodis Law Office's Facebook Live. We are very fortunate today to have a very special guest. We have Professor Jenny Carroll from the law school, the University of Alabama Law School. And we're going to be talking about just voting issues during COVID. This is a very important election we have coming up. Many people are concerned about reporting to polling places in person. And so there are some important issues here in Alabama and nationally pertaining to voting. Professor Carroll, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So for our viewers, Professor Jenny Carroll has a very impressive background. She, of course, serves as a professor at the law school at the University of Alabama. And even though I'm 34 years out of law school, I'm still intimidated by law school professors. So I'll probably be saying a lot of yes ma'ams today during the presentation, Professor. But in addition to authoring numerous law review articles for non-attorneys, that means a lot. She also serves as a co-chair of the 11th Circuit Amicus Committee, or vice chair, the Criminal Defense Attorneys Amicus Committee. But most importantly for today's show, you served as chair of the advisory committee, the Alabama Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And in your role as chair of that advisory committee, the committee issued a report, and the title of the report, it came out earlier this year, is Barriers to Voting in Alabama. And I encourage our viewers, we'll put up a link to that presentation on our Facebook page. I encourage you to go to it and read it. It's fascinating. It will give you some perspective as to the history of voting. But Professor, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially following the Civil Rights or Voting Rights Act of 1965, there was an opinion issued by the United States Supreme Court involving the county I'm sitting in today, Shelby County, Alabama. It was Shelby County versus Holder. And as a result of that, the state of Alabama came up with some policies and procedures pertaining to voting. And your committee issued this report upon a review of those findings. If you could just tell me a little bit about the committee and this report and the conclusions that you reached, Professor.
Sure. So we are a bipartisan appointed committee. We serve as an advisory committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. We also serve to advise Congress. And I did actually testify both before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights as well as congressional committees about the findings from this report. So the committee does important work. We are a fact-finding organization, which means that our role is not to write policy, but as you said, to do an analysis of what exactly is going on in a particular state. We are all residents of the state of Alabama. That's one of the requirements to be on the committee. I have served as chair of the committee since 2016. That's a role I'm still active in. And I'm lucky. I have a committee that is full of active members who are very engaged. They come from all different backgrounds. We have lawyers, we have professors, we have just a variety of different types of folks on our committee, all of whom are committed to doing the work of the committee, gathering information. We do focus on different topics. The report that you're referencing was on voting rights. We embarked on a 2-year study of what was implemented in our state following the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder. It's important to note that a lot of the laws that we looked at had actually been passed prior to Shelby County versus Holder, but the state had delayed implementing them because they wanted to see if the Supreme Court was going to strike down the pre-clearance requirement in the Voting Rights Act. So the just to give you a little idea of what that is in kind of plain English, the pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act was a really critical component of that act because it required that when a state that had a past history of either placing barriers to voting in place or discriminating against voters in some way, when they wanted to enact any sort of statute or regulation that might have an effect on voters, they actually had to get clearance from the Department of Justice, which is why Holder is the person who's being sued by Alabama, right? He's the Attorney General at the time. Right. And they had to, as part of getting that pre-clearance, they had to demonstrate that whatever they were proposing to do wouldn't have a disparate impact or an unequal impact on minority voting populations. And they bore the financial burden of doing that, but they also bore the burden of proof, right? So they were the ones who had to prove that it wouldn't adversely impact these populations. Well, when Shelby County was decided, the Supreme Court did say that pre-clearance section of the Voting Rights Act is basically an anachronism. It's old now, right? We've moved on since 1965. We want to give states the opportunity to regulate their elections themselves. And so they struck it down. And what that meant for the state was, instead of having to ask the Justice Department before they could enact any of these regulations or statutes that affected voting, if they could do that, now all of a sudden they could just implement them. And it was up to individual citizens to file a claim and bear the burden of proof that this decision that the state had made somehow adversely affected their access to the ballot. And we have seen a slew of litigation, right, over all of these different voting regulations that were put in place by Alabama following the Shelby County decision. But, you know, it's again, it hasn't been as successful in terms of challenging those provisions. One, because the plaintiffs are now bearing the burden of finding a lawyer, paying for that lawyer, financing the litigation. But they're also bearing the burden of proof, right? So they have to prove to the court now that there is a disparate impact rather than the state having to prove no disparate impact. So it's made a big difference. And one of the things that Congress is considering, what made this report so important, is one of the things Congress is considering now is whether or not it wants to re-implement that pre-clearance requirement. And so in order to make a decision about whether it's necessary to re-implement a pre-clearance requirement, they need to know what's going on in the states. So that's what this report was designed to do. It's designed to provide information about this is our view from the ground here in Alabama.
And the report said that there were two primary findings, and again, I encourage our viewers to read the entire report, but the policies and procedures we have in Alabama were enacted primarily to prevent fraud. However, the committee found that there was no evidence of any significant fraud with voting in Alabama. And then second, that the result, unfortunately, was that a lot of the policies and procedures that were implemented had a disparate impact upon certain communities and created barriers to people voting, a very important right that we have in this country. Can you elaborate upon those two conclusions?
Sure. So with regard to the first one, what you're really talking about is the reason that the state gave, right? So we're talking about both the legislature, but also the Attorney General and Secretary of State's office gave for why these changes in Alabama's law was so important, right? And the reason they gave is they were concerned about voter fraud. And in particular, they were concerned about individual voter fraud, right? In other words, individual voters would be voting illegally or be voting in a way that was not permitted under Alabama's election procedures. And so one of the big questions that the committee had is, I mean, that sounds like a legitimate, compelling state interest.
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't think there's anyone who says, I'm hoping for voter fraud this year, right? So one of the questions the committee had was, how rampant was this voter fraud, right? Was this something that was going on that really required the state to step in and take some action? And then the second question was, how effective are these provisions in actually curbing whatever voter fraud might occur, right? So, it's a pretty basic question, right? I mean, think of yourself as a consumer, right? As a member of the state, right? Whenever a law is passed, you want to ask yourself, do I really need this? And also, will it really do what I hope it'll do, right? Because otherwise, I'm not sure why the law exists. So when we started looking at, and again, we're talking to state officials, right? We're not just talking to, folks who are claiming that the provisions created a barrier to their own enfranchisement, their own opportunity to vote. We really started by talking to the state officials and saying, hey, tell us a little bit about what was going on in the state before these laws were passed. And what we learned, and again, the Secretary of State's office was very generous in providing us with information about rates of voter fraud. And what we learned from him in testimony before the committee, as well as in documentation that they submitted as requested by the committee, was that prior to the passage of these laws, there weren't actually voter fraud complaints that at least not of the type that had been described as the impetus or the reason for the law's passage. So that was a little concerning. The second thing we noticed is in instances where voter fraud had been found either by a court or by another state official, right? So sometimes it's brought before a federal judge and a federal judge makes a determination that voter fraud has occurred. Sometimes it's the Board of Registrars that makes the decision. Sometimes it's the Attorney General's office that makes the decision about whether or not voter fraud is occurring. But when we looked at those types of cases, which again, were provided to us by these offices, what we found was that the types of provisions that the state had implemented were not actually the types of provisions that would prevent this type of fraud. So that was concerning, right? So we both had questions about whether or not we needed the laws, but we also had questions about whether or not the laws were accomplishing those articulated state goals. And I'll give you a concrete example. So Alabama implemented a voter ID law immediately after the Shelby County decision came down. And it's one of the most restrictive voter ID laws in the country, right? It limits the type of ID a voter can use, right? And in addition to that, it's a strict requirement. The voter has to either have the ID or be able to come up with two people who work at the polling place who can identify them as the voter they claim to be. So it's an incredibly restrictive law. And when I asked the Secretary of State's office about how many instances had come up in which voters attempted to vote, had been caught voting using someone else's ID, his office directed me to a website that compiled this type of information. And there were exactly 2 cases on that website that involved voter ID fraud, where an individual voter walked in and used an ID that did not properly identify them in order to cast a ballot. But here's the catch. Those IDs that they used were actually properly issued IDs by the state of Alabama. So the voter had an ID that under the law entitled them to vote. Now the problem was the ID wasn't really them, right? And that's a problem, right? That sort of identity assumption is a problem. But the voter ID law wouldn't have solved that problem, right? So that's a whole other issue, right? Because the voter had the required ID. So again, that raises concerns that as good as the state's intentions are, and again, I do want to emphasize, and the report emphasizes this, there is no one on our committee, there is no one I know who is out there trying to create a fraudulent election, right? That is not the goal. But the laws that were passed are not actually addressing either any fraud that actually existed prior to their passage, nor are they solving the problem for any fraud that may exist since their passage. So that brings the second question that you raised, right? Which is, are they creating barriers, right? So if they don't have any harmful effect, right, even if they don't accomplish their purpose, we may say, I don't understand why they were passed. I don't understand why we need them, but they're not hurting anyone, right? But that's not what's going on here. So what we found on our committee is that some of these regulations, right, whether you're talking about ID requirements, voter registration requirements, restrictions on absentee ballots, right? We could go through the whole list, and the report is 60 some odd pages long, right? So there's a lot in there. But we could go through that whole list, and what we found was that people in rural areas, right, who may not have access to either transportation or government services that are open the same amount of time as in other jurisdictions. People who are marginalized because they're either part of a racial or ethnic minority, or they live at or below the poverty line, may actually have trouble meeting some of these requirements. And so even though these requirements are neutral on their face, nobody's writing a statute in Alabama that says, we require voter ID because we really want to make sure poor people can't vote in our state, right? Like, that's not what they're saying.
Right.
They have that effect, and that's what concerned the committee. And again, we looked at lots of different things. We looked at lots of both statutes as well as regulations that are put out by state agencies like the Secretary of State's office. And we raise these concerns. And again, there's varying degrees of concern, right? We're not saying that it's every single regulation creates the same level of concern. But we did as a committee feel like it was important to recognize that these types of regulations and restrictions can have the same effect of preventing people from realizing their opportunity to vote as some of the more egregious examples that we tend to think about pre-1965, like, sheriffs literally blocking the doorway, or requirements that a voter be able to tell how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, right? I mean, these are not those types of regulations, but if they have the same effect, we should be just as worried about them. And I actually, before we go to the next topic, I actually want to, fast forward to now, right? Because what we're seeing now is the Secretary of State has made a number of adjustments and provisions for the upcoming November election in light of the public health pandemic that COVID-19 has created. But we're still seeing, despite some of those adjustments that he's made, we're still hearing reports of long lines to cast ballots as part of early voting. We're still hearing reports of people having trouble getting copies of IDs. If they've lost their ID, the NVD may not be open or may be more restricted in terms of who it'll allow in at a various time. We're hearing reports of folks saying that they are not receiving their mail in a timely fashion, or they're receiving their mail irregularly. And as a result, their request for an absentee ballot, even though it was made a while back, they still haven't gotten their absentee ballot. And I think it's important to stress that there are lots of different ways to create barriers to voting. I said to someone the other day, I was on the phone actually with an absentee election administrator in a county where the line was really long or not really. And I said, there's different type, and the administrator said, this isn't a poll tax, right? This isn't, you keep talking about barriers to voting. This isn't a poll tax. And I said, there's lots of different ways to tax people, right? And asking people to stand in line for hours to cast a vote, right? That is a tax on their time that may ask people to make choices between showing up to work or taking care of their child or spending time with an elderly person that they're the primary care provider for. It can be stressful for voters to have to stand in these lines for so long, and especially during a pandemic, right? I mean, all those things we normally worry about are just exaggerated. And so, the position I took with this particular official was, that is a type of poll tax, and we need to acknowledge that and recognize it. And we need to think about ways to mitigate that. Now, lots of counties have done that, and I don't mean to suggest that there's indifference, right? We saw in Jefferson County, they hired a whole new group of folks, or they moved a group of folks into that absentee election office in order to facilitate people trying to vote early. And I think that's great, and I applaud that. But again, I think we need to recognize a huge effect on people's ability to cast their ballots.
Professor Carroll, I want to emphasize just a couple of things that you just said, particularly because we're broadcasting this on social media today. Number one, your committee, a bipartisan committee made up of people that worked for no compensation, did a vast amount of research, talked to a number of different public officials, held public hearings, and found no evidence of any type of widespread fraud. In fact, very little fraud or evidence of fraud at all. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is, in a lot of people have difficulty, people that have been fortunate enough to live comfortable lives, and I'm one of them. What's the big deal coming up with an ID? I have my driver's license with me, but it is tough for a lot of people. And it is tough, if you don't want to think of it on a racial basis, think of your elderly, perhaps grandparents, somebody that may live in an assisted living facility. The very idea of having to locate a driver's license they may not have used for years, or having to get a replacement one by going and waiting in lines. I finished law school. I've practiced law for a number of years, but my wife and I recently went through the process to get one of the new enhanced driver's license, smart driver's license, or whatever they are. It was an ordeal. I'll tell you, there were a lot of forms to fill out, a lot of waiting. And we'll get into this later, but we also made the decision to vote absentee this year. That process alone in Alabama is a complicated process, and I'm still not certain that my ballot's going to be counted, but I'm going to do everything possible to make sure it is. So, Professor, let's talk about the actual process, because this is important. I think you'll agree this is probably going to be one of the most important elections we've had in this country in a long time. And if it's anything like the last election, it could be a very close election. So these little nuances that could impact a percentage of the votes could have a significant impact. So let's talk about the procedure in Alabama. There's a lot of talk on social media about voting by mail. Mm-hmm. My firm practices in 3 states, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, and we don't have, per se, voting by mail in any of these states. But in Alabama, you can vote absentee through the mail. Mm-hmm. And before we get into the particular dates and procedures, you mentioned this earlier, our Secretary of State, Secretary Merrill in Alabama, has done some things during this pandemic to make it a little bit easier for people to vote. And the primary thing is, if you can certify that you have genuine concerns, and again, please correct me if I'm paraphrasing incorrectly, genuine concerns about entering a public voting place, that suffices as a medical reason to vote absentee this year. So to our viewers in Alabama, if you're concerned about going into a polling place and standing in lines and perhaps being around crowds to vote, that is a valid reason, according to our Secretary of State, to vote absentee.
Yes, and I just want to clarify one thing. So I actually printed out a copy of the application for absentee ballot, which I have right, which is
great,
very long and complicated. But there's a series of boxes that you can check on here that say you're applying for an absentee ballot because, and they're the same reasons that mimic that affidavit that we'll talk about in a minute about when you cast your absentee ballot that you have to certify. And what the Secretary of State has said is the second box, the one that deals with, I have a physical illness or infirmity which prevents my attendance at the polls. He has said that he is interpreting that to include, during this pandemic, fear that you might contract COVID-19 or might be exposed to COVID-19. And the certification that you're describing, you don't have to get a note from your doctor saying you're especially vulnerable, right? You check the box. That's what you're required to do. Now, it may be that an absentee election manager, also known as an AEM, will follow up with you on that, especially if you have a history of absentee voting, they may follow up with you. But as I understand it, and this is on the Secretary of State's website, the only information you have to provide at that point is, I was worried about the pandemic. So, I mean, he's taken this very generous approach, I think, to being allowed to use, I think, what is a legitimate health concern, right, to serve as a basis, even if you don't fall into an especially vulnerable group. So you don't have to be over the age of 65. You don't have to have a pre-existing condition that might make you vulnerable. You don't have to be actively showing symptoms of COVID-19, right? All you have to do is say, I don't think it's safe for me and my family to go to a place where I might be exposed when I don't have to be exposed. So I think that's positive. Now, I also want to say, right, that he has chosen to leave in place other aspects of absentee balloting that I think are problematic. And there's actually a pending lawsuit right now in the 11th Circuit in which there's an ongoing discussion about whether it's appropriate for him to leave all these in place. And one thing, and we'll talk more about this later, but I want to throw this out now because I can't say it enough. The current 11th Circuit position is that the counties may make a choice to allow for curbside drop-off of absentee ballots. And that's despite the fact that the Secretary of State does not support curbside voting and has made it clear that that is contrary to the position of the state. But the 11th Circuit has said that they believe that curbside voting is in fact the safest way to drop off an absentee ballot if a person wants to do it in person. And it also allows for multiple locations for drop-off. Which again, depending on which county you're in, I grew up in rural South Texas, right? Our counties were big. You had to go to the county seat where my parents' house is. It's about a 45-minute drive. So I appreciate, right, the effort of the federal courts to make sure that especially folks who live in those rural areas where the county seat may be far away, it may only be open during their working hours, right, that we're gonna set up alternative places where y'all can drop off your ballot.
Well, we could probably do a whole nother show on the Dropbox issue in Texas for voting. But for our viewers that are not attorneys, the 11th Circuit that we refer to is the federal appellate court that oversees all of the federal district courts in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. It's the rung between the federal courts here in Alabama and the United States Supreme Court. It's an important court. And these are important issues that are being considered. So, Professor, we know that Election Day is fastly approaching. It's Tuesday, November 3rd, and people that want to vote in person will do so on that date. Tell me, what is the deadline, first of all, to request an absentee ballot, and is there an exception to that deadline?
Yes. So, under Alabama state law, you have to request your absentee ballot no later than the 5th calendar day prior to the election. So that's Thursday, October 29th, for those of you who don't want to pull out your calendar and count on. So you have to request your ballot by Thursday, October 29th. Now, there is an exception that you pointed out. So let's say between Thursday, October 29th and November 2nd, which is the day before the election, something happens in your life, right? You become ill and require surgery. Your workplace requires you to leave unexpectedly. Alabama does have a provision for emergency absentee balloting based on unforeseen circumstances. And the Secretary of State's website lays out what those emergency unforeseen circumstances are. If you want to request a ballot under that provision, you have to do so by 5 p.m. the day before the election, which, as I said, is the election is November 3rd, so you got to request it by 5 p.m. on November 2nd. And you're going to have to be able to articulate what is the emergency that requires me to be out of town. And again, it can be things like I have to have unexpected surgery, right? I have to leave town for work, right? Those are two kind of classic examples of that emergency provision.
So the emergency provision does exist, but for the majority of people that choose to vote absentee, and again, the restrictions for absentee voting are loosened somewhat in Alabama this year during the pandemic. The deadline is the Thursday, the 29th of October.
Correct.
What is the procedure if somebody wants to vote absentee?
Okay, so we have a two-part process because that's what lawyers like. We like two-part processes, right? From law school. So the first part is you have to request the absentee ballot. And you can do that in a couple different ways. You can mail in a request for an absentee ballot to your absentee election manager. Again, it's also known as an AEM. And if you go to the Secretary of State's website, the AEMs are broken down by county, and he provides a list that includes the mailing address for the AEM. He also includes an online application for an absentee ballot, which again, I've downloaded mine here so you can see it. And if you're going to make that request by mail, you send it in and you can have the AEM mail you the ballot back. The other way you can do it, requesting the absentee ballot, is to do so in person. So you can go to the AEM's physical office, which is usually in the county courthouse. I think all of them are in the county courthouse in Alabama, but I could be wrong, so check where it is. But you go, you make the request in person, and they will physically hand you an absentee ballot. Now, in order to acquire that absentee ballot either by mail or in person, you're going to have a few things. First of all, as I said, there is the application, right? The application asks you really basic stuff. What's your name? Where do you live? What's your date of birth, right? That's all designed to ensure that we have your identity correct and that we know what precinct you're supposed to be voting in, right? Because we don't want you casting an absentee ballot that's not going to get counted because you voted in the wrong precinct. It's then going to ask you what election you're requesting an absentee ballot for. If you want to vote in the November 3rd election, right, if that's what you're hoping to cast a ballot in, you would be asking for the general election, right, the November general election. You check that box off. You're not asking to vote in the primary or special election. You want the general election. And then the next section asks you to say why you want to request an absentee ballot. And again, there's a whole list of reasons of why, but the second one is the one that John Merrill has interpreted as being broad and encompassing concerns about COVID-19. So if you're in Alabama and you want to request an absentee ballot because you're worried about showing up and voting in a polling place where you feel like it may not be safe for you because of the pandemic, that's the one you want to check. Now, the other thing you have to provide with your absentee ballot is a copy of your valid photos, your state-issued photo ID. And again, that's the ID you would use if you were going to vote in person in Alabama. You have to make a copy of it and enclose it with your ballot request. In addition to that, you need to sign the bottom of the absentee ballot. That's by signing it, you're swearing or affirming that you are entitled to make this request and the information you've provided is correct. If you can't sign your name, if you're signing with an X or another mark that's not a signature, you're going to also have to get a witness to sign this application for an absentee ballot. So let's say we did all of that. We did our application for an absentee ballot either by mail or in person, and now we want to actually cast our absentee ballot, right, which is the second step of that two-part process. So in Alabama actually allowed early voting by absentee ballot this year. And again, it was part of Merrill's efforts to expand opportunities to vote in the face of the pandemic. So beginning on September 10th in Alabama, you were able to vote absentee. You can do that in person up until October 29th. And you can do that at your AEM's office. And again, that list of AEM physical addresses is provided by the Secretary of State. I would recommend calling the AEM's office before you show up. One of the things I found is when I called a bunch of different AEM offices, they all have different office hours. So make sure you know when they're actually there and actually taking your ballot so you don't waste your time trying to go down there. If you cast that absentee ballot in person, you're going to have to bring your ID again, right? So that ID that you used to vote, that you would have ordinarily used to vote in person, you're going to have to bring it with you when you cast that absentee ballot. If you cast the absentee ballot by mail, you have to have your ballot postmarked by November 2nd, which is the day before the election. And here's the other tricky part. It has to be received by the AEM by noon on November 3rd, which is the day of the election. So lots of people, as you can imagine, are deciding that they want to vote in person absentee because they want to make sure that ballot gets in. If you can't do that for whatever reason, maybe you're elderly, maybe you lack transportation, right? There's a whole slew of reasons why you may not be able to vote in person. What I have told voters who have talked to me about this at various forums I've done is make a plan, right? Have a plan for when you're going to complete your ballot and how you're going to get it into the AEM. And you can mail it in, right? That's perfectly fine. Just make sure you do it with enough time that you make sure it's getting to the AEM by noon on November 3rd. You can also drop off a completed absentee ballot in person by 5 p.m. on November 2nd. So if you're worried about the mail, you could fill out your absentee ballot and just take it in and drop it off at the AEM. And that's what we're seeing with this curbside voting. I mean, that's what that is. You're dropping it off at a curbside place if your county has it. I've talked to some AEMs across the state. They're trying to set up, if they haven't already, lines that essentially are just for dropping off completed absentee ballots. So they're trying to make that a more efficient way for folks to vote. Now, I don't know if you want me to talk about this yet, but I'm going to do it, is the logistics of casting an absentee ballot, because you're right, it's complicated, right? And
it is.
Yeah, in addition,
you have to get the right envelope and the right envelope. And
oh, I know. So, okay, so I tried to break it down really simply, okay?
Right.
So there's 3 envelopes in Alabama that come with your absentee ballot, okay? So after you fill out your absentee ballot, okay, so you've made your decision of how you want to vote. And I will tell you, if you're not sure, or if you're like me and you don't like to have to decide on the fly, you can print up a sample ballot for your county so that you know what you can expect to see on that ballot. And you can write yourself notes and make all sorts of decisions and do research about who you want to vote for. And you can click on your county's page for sample ballot on the Secretary of State's website. That's what I did. My county is Jefferson County, so this is the sample Jefferson County ballot. And once I make my decisions about how I want to vote, I can take this with me, right? Same thing with an absentee ballot. I can spend my time with it. I can try to figure it out. Once I fill it out, though, and cast that ballot, and again, the absentee ballot's going to look a lot like the sample ballot, right? It's exactly like what you would get if you went to a polling place. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in a plain envelope that comes with my absentee ballot. And that plain envelope is just designed to keep my vote a secret, right? So think of that plain envelope as your secret C envelope, okay? There's nothing on it. Just put your ballot in there, fold it up, put it in that envelope. Now, this one becomes really important. The second envelope, that is the affidavit envelope. And the affidavit envelope has a bunch of information on it. I actually printed up a copy of the affidavit that I was going to show you guys, but it literally, on my printer, it took up 3 pages. They cram it onto this little envelope, okay? So let's talk about what that affidavit is. So the affidavit, it asks the voter to swear or affirm, right? So you're making a promise that you are the person you claim to be, right? That you are a person who lives in county in Alabama, that you are entitled to cast a vote. You're asked your date of birth, not only to confirm your identity, but to confirm that you're over the age of 18, which is a requirement in our state to vote. And you are also asked to sign the affidavit envelope, right, with your signature certifying, again, who you are. But this is where it gets really tricky. In addition to your signature on that affidavit ballot, so I've done my regular signature. I'm not signing with an X. I'm signing Jenny Carroll out in script, just like the nuns taught me to do in 2nd grade, right? I also have to either have 2 witnesses who are over the age of 18 sign off on that affidavit that I am, in fact, who I claimed I was, or I have to have a notary sign off and notarize the affidavit for me, or I have to find some other official who is authorized to take this type of affidavit and sign off on it. And this has been a really big controversy in Alabama, because if the whole idea behind me requesting an absentee ballot is I want to keep my bubble intact, I don't want to be exposed to a bunch of other people who may or may not have COVID-19, and I'm trying to protect myself and my family, right? Having to go out and find 2 witnesses who are over the age of 18, right, may require me to break that bubble and go outside of my safety zone. Because I don't know about you, but there aren't 2 people besides me over the age of 18 in my household, right? There's my husband, he's over 18, right? But my kids are under the age of 18, right? So I would have to go and get somebody else who could sign off on that. Or there's no notaries in my household, right? I mean, I know everybody's different, but there's no notaries in my household. So I have to go out and get a notary to sign it. There's also no officials in my household who are authorized to sign off on these affidavits under state law. So if I want to go that route, I'm going to have to go outside my home. I'm going to have to find someone else. And again, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. Is this going to be a barrier for everyone? No, right? I'd probably go next door and knock on my neighbor's door and ask her to sign my ballot for me, or sign my affidavit for me as my second witness. witness besides my husband. But for elderly voters, right, who may be living alone,
Exactly.
for folks
Exactly.
for folks who are really vulnerable, right, this may be an issue. And the lawsuit that we talked about a minute ago that's before the 11th Circuit, one of the issues that came up in that is they were requesting that for voters who are 65 or older, which we know public health officials have identified as a special risk for COVID-19. There was a request that signature requirement of either witnesses or a notary be waived for those folks. And the 11th Circuit struck that portion down in part because our election officials pushed back on that and said, no, we need these witnesses and we need these notaries.
Even though there's no evidence whatsoever of any fraud having transpired. And
well,
again, I want to emphasize again for our viewers, those of us, Professor Carroll, you're a law professor. You've been through law school. I've been through law school. For it's not that big of a deal for one of us to get a couple of witnesses or to get a notary. It's a hassle, but there are people that are living in the circumstances that makes it very difficult, and it's a barrier, and it's unnecessary because, again, there's not been a problem that has necessitated these type requirements. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted to make that point.
No, and I totally agree with you on that point. And again, I think it's what we talked about in the very beginning, right? Every time you put a new requirement in place, you are going to exclude some people, right? It's going to be harder for some people to vote. And that's really what we worry about. Now, I do want to emphasize, in Alabama, the biggest area of voter fraud going away, of suits where voter fraud have been implicated, have been around absentee ballots. And it's been for this failure to get notaries and witnesses. But I also want to be clear, when we talk about that as fraud, right, often what we're talking about were ballots that were turned in that were not perfected, right? They were ballots who didn't have those two signatures, which is really different, right, than you or I saying, hey, let's cast a bunch of ballots that are not actually valid. And I do want to just say too, one of the things that really strikes me about this requirement for two witnesses, remember when we were talking about our application for absentee ballot a minute ago? And I said the only reason you need a witness on this is if you can't sign your name, right? If you're signing with an X, then you have to have a witness that says that X is Jenny Carroll's signature.
Right.
But on the ballot, it doesn't matter if you can sign your name. You still have to have those two witnesses, right? So I have talked to voters who have told me that they didn't understand that they needed the two witnesses after they had signed their name. And of course, the other problem, and you raised this actually in the context of your own absentee ballot, right? This concern that it's not going to get counted.
Right.
You also hear voters say, it wasn't until well after the election that I found out, if I ever found out, that my absentee ballot wasn't completed correctly, even though I sent it in with plenty of time so that somebody could have told me that it needed to be corrected. Now, in theory, the AEM is supposed to notify the voter, right? There's something wrong with your ballot. You forgot to include your ID. You forgot to, get that second witness signature. We're concerned that the signature on your absentee ballot doesn't match the signature we have on file for you, right? That's another reason why these absentee ballots often fail. But you also hear from voters, and again, election officials are pretty upfront about it. When it gets closer and closer to the time for the election, the probability that those notices are going to go out with enough time for the voter to actually make the correction goes down precipitously. So have your plan, right? This is why you need a plan. So once you finish that affidavit envelope, that's our second envelope, right? Remember I said there were three? So your third envelope that you have to then put it in is you have to put it in the mailing envelope. And that's the envelope with the pre-printed address. You got to put a stamp on it, right? There's scads of absentee ballots I hear about getting returned because somebody forgot to put a stamp. But the other thing in Alabama, which is not this way in every state, but it's this way in Alabama, you can only put one absentee ballot per mailing envelope. So if you and your wife, say, wanted to mail in your absentee ballots, you got to put them in separate mailing envelopes, and you better have two stamps, right? You got to have a stamp for each envelope to send it on in. If you don't, those ballots are not getting counted. Now, the Secretary of State's website does have a spot where you can click on Track My Absentee Ballot. You can type in your name. You can type in your date of birth, which is what is used to identify voters in the state of Alabama, and it will tell you whether or not an absentee ballot that is associated with this voter has been received. So, Brad, if you wanted to find out whether or not your absentee ballot has made it into your AEM, right, that's a way you can do it if you mail it. Now, obviously, if you're voting in person, right, you know it made it in, right? You're giving it to it. But saying that it's arrived is not the same as saying it's going to be counted, right, because it's valid.
Well, the actual language, and I did go through those steps, and I went to the website, and it said that my ballot had been accepted, but I'm not exactly sure if accepted just means received or counted, and that's misleading.
Yeah, it means it's received, right? So it hasn't been counted yet. It's been received. And the problem is you're not going to know if it's been counted. And again, there are provisions. The Secretary of State, one of the things, I'm not an election law expert. That's not what I know about. I was a criminal defense lawyer. I teach criminal law. I teach criminal procedure. So I spent 2 years learning election law. And let me tell you, Alabama's is complicated. And the Secretary of State actually has not only a giant book that's about 30 or 300 pages, which I read, that lays out all the different ways elections work, but he has separate pamphlets on each of these issues. And he has one that is 25 pages long that deals with just this question: how do we figure out when this ballot is actually going to get counted, right, when it's valid, and how do we inform the voter if it's being counted? And what I found when I was doing the research for this report is, even though there are these provisions in place, when you actually talk to those AEMs, those absentee election managers, they say, gosh, if we're getting high volumes of ballots in and we've got to get this information out to the voter and allow the voter to correct the ballot by the Friday after the election. So remember, the election's Tuesday, and by Friday, you've got to have that ballot corrected in order for it to be counted. It just doesn't happen. So, it's kind of one of those things where, yeah, there's a possible remedy out there, but it's going to be hard to get to.
Professor Carroll, one thing I want to follow up on, you made a comment. You said one area where we do have a good bit of fraud in Alabama pertains to absentee ballots. Now, as an attorney, with the term fraud, I'm looking for an intent to mislead. But to clarify, you're just saying that the ballots, for some reason, something was defective and they're not being counted.
Yes. So there is a big volume of cases that are like that. There are also cases that are more along the lines of what you're describing with absentee ballots, where and again, we're not talking about a lot of ballots here. That's the other thing to keep in mind. When I say there's a fair number of cases, you're talking about, 5 ballots here, 20 ballots here, 40 ballots here. But that number of ballots can make a difference, particularly in a local election, right? So we do see cases involving what you're describing as fraud, that true criminal definition of fraud, where, and ironically, the people who are accused of engaging in that fraud are often election officials. They're the ones who are filling out the blank ballots themselves. Right. So, it is an intent to defraud, and that, some of these people ended up with criminal convictions for fraud under exactly the type of thing you're describing. But you also have other cases that are that other category that I'm describing, which is they're identifying it as possible voter fraud, but it's something like there's something wrong with the ballot, right? Like the signature doesn't look quite right, or you forgot to get 2 witnesses to sign, or a notary, right? And so, I think it's important to keep in mind when, you talk about absentee fraud, it's easy to say, wow, that's a big thing and I'm really worried about it. And first of all, it's important to keep in mind, we're not talking about huge number of ballots. So if we're talking about like a federal election, which we've got 2 federal elections at play, right, on this November 3rd election. We've got the presidential election, and then we've got a senatorial election in Alabama. Those are national seats. So everybody in the state is going to vote on it. Odds are, it might be close. I don't know. I'm not good at predicting elections. I gave up after 2016. But, those 20 votes, 40 votes, even 100 votes, 600 votes, right, which are some of the numbers we see in some of these cases, they're not going to make a difference in those national elections if the trends we've seen in the past are any indication. So, you know, and again, people who know far more about elections across the country than I do have written quite a bit about election fraud. And even they say that the fraud that occurs within the context of absentee voting, right, individual voter fraud in the context of absentee voting is very, very rare. And it's insignificant. Justin Levitt, who is one of the experts in the country on this issue, he's out in Los Angeles. He actually testified before the U.S. Commission about this, and we relied on some of his testimony as we began our own research. And he says it's really, if you look at the total number of ballots, you know, cast, it's relatively insignificant. And what's much more likely is a voter is not going to vote because they can't get two witnesses together. They can't get a notary. They don't have a stamp to put on the envelope. The mail system doesn't get the ballot in on time. They don't have time to stand in line waiting for the AEM so that they can cast an in-person ballot, right? That is a much more likely occurrence than actual fraud.
Which gets back to what we started with, and that was the basic finding of your committee's report. There is no widespread evidence of fraud, yet these restrictions are in place that unfortunately limit voting, and in large part by people in communities that may be of lower income or may have be in more rural areas. It may make it more difficult for them to vote. I will ask, and we do not have voting by mail per se in the state of Alabama or Mississippi or Tennessee, but the study that you made reference to, the experts that said there was no evidence of fraud or widespread evidence of fraud with absentee ballot, it's my understanding that also pertained to just general voting by mail. Am I correct?
That is correct. And we do have states, so states like Oregon and Washington State, for example, everybody gets mailed a ballot. And they don't show any higher rates of fraud than we find in in-person voting. And again, spoiler alert, it's really low. It's really low in person, it's really low by mail, and it's really low by absenteeism. And I get it. I mean, again, nobody wants voter fraud to occur. Nobody is pro-voter fraud. But I feel like that specter, particularly in this election, right, where lots of people are talking about the probability and the possibility of fraud, I think it's really overblown. And I think we would be much better served as a nation if we focused on what is really preventing people from voting. And, you know, again, to paraphrase the president, if the cure is worse than what the actual illness is, right? I mean, he raised that in a very different context than I'm raising it. But I mean, in this case, I really do think this is an instance. The steps we're trying to take to prevent these rare cases of voter fraud are having a much bigger impact in restricting and reducing the number of votes we're getting from people who are legitimate voters who have an interest in voting. And, you know, we've talked about absentee balloting, we've talked about voter ID, and I do want to just throw out there too with voter ID, one of the things that I did, one of my favorite parts of the report that I did, is I actually got in contact with every MVD office in the state. That was how I spent my spare time. And I found a couple where I could literally never find anybody in the office. And if that's the primary place where people pick up those IDs to vote, and I literally can't ever, I mean, and literally in one of the counties, I walked over, I drove out there, I went, it was supposed to be during the time that the office was supposed to be open. I couldn't find anybody. I hadn't been able to get anyone on the phone. And I mean, I'm literally calling from outside the office and hearing the recording saying they're open now, and I'm looking at a closed office. So I walked over to the county courthouse and said, hey, you know, I'm trying to get an ID through the MVD, what's going on? And they literally said, you'd be better off going to another county to get your ID. And again, that should bother us. Not everybody, I acknowledge I am incredibly privileged that I have a job that lets me explore kind of those intellectual curiosity questions of, can you actually get a voter ID in this county? But not everybody gets to do that. And, I've told this story before and I will say it again. I am the granddaughter of people who worked in factories and in fields. I grew up in a rural area, and I remember my grandfather who I adored, telling me that the day he stopped voting was the day that the state changed the law so that he didn't get paid if he was not at work, if he was out voting. And I asked him about it. I said, well, what difference? I said, how long did it take you to vote? And he said, well, it was about an hour away from where my workplace was, between where the precinct was and where he lived. And my grandpa worked a swing shift, which meant that he went into work before the polling places were open. So he had to leave work in order to vote, because when he came home, he was responsible for watching my mother and her brother. And he said, I only missed about an hour to 2 hours of work because I could use my lunch hour as part of that time that I could vote. But he said, for our family, losing an hour or two of wages was the difference between knowing that we would be able to feed the kids, or knowing that the electricity would stay on in the house, or that we could pay the water bill, or that I could make my payment on my car, or whatever emergency expenses might come up for a working family. And he said, I couldn't do that. I couldn't make that choice. So I gave up that right to vote instead. And even after he retired, my grandfather never voted again, because he said nobody valued it and nobody treated the working poor, which is what my grandfather was, right, as if he was someone whose voice mattered in the election. And that's what I'm seeing in Alabama. So the reason I feel passionately about this is it's personal to me, right? I saw that for somebody I love.
And those people that are out working every day and just barely getting by and trying to support a family, those are the people that their opinions and their vote really matters in this country, in my opinion. Professor, we're getting near the end of the hour. I'm looking back at my notes. One important question we had here is, if somebody does suspect voter fraud, if they see something they think is inappropriate or something, what should they do? How should they report that?
So there's a couple different things they can do. One thing they can do is they can report it to the Secretary of State's office. In Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida. I didn't check Georgia, but all of those states, right? The Secretary of State's office is charged with investigating allegations of voter fraud. So that's one step. If you don't want to report it to the Secretary of State's office, you can report it to a poll worker if you're at a polling place, or an AEM if you're at the Absentee Election Manager's office. You can also report it to most polling places in Alabama have what's called poll watchers present. This is something I've done before, where you go and you're an observer. You can also report it to a poll watcher. A poll watcher is identified with a badge that indicates they're a poll watcher. And the poll watcher can serve as an intermediary for the voter and provide the information either to the poll worker or to the Secretary of State's office. And again, if you're seeing fraud occur in the polling place, probably your best bet is to go ahead and first alert somebody in that polling place and see if you can stop the fraud before it goes any further. But if you can't, if you don't feel safe, if you don't feel comfortable, if there's some other barrier, you can't get through the line in time to alert somebody to what's going on, you can go ahead and call it into the Secretary of State's office. And he actually has a hotline, and he's got 3 different numbers listed on that hotline that you can reach out and contact. And again, I don't care what party you're part of. I don't care whether you're a lifetime voter or an occasional voter. I don't care if you're the Secretary of State or you're just an ordinary citizen like me. Nobody wants election fraud to occur. So if you are concerned about it, file the report. That's why those officials are there.
Thank you. We are up against the hour, and I like to keep these episodes at an hour or less. Professor, you have provided such valuable information on such an important issue. Our right to vote in this country is such a sacred right, and I encourage all of our viewers, there are some hurdles you may have to go through to make sure your vote is counted, but it's worth it. The future of our country is at stake, regardless of which side you want to vote on. Professor, I want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for your service on the advisory committee and all the members of your committee. And Secretary Merrill, as you say, there are still some restrictions in place, but I do thank the Secretary and his office for allowing people during this pandemic to to vote by absentee if they have a genuine concern about reporting to a polling place and voting in person this year. So, Professor, again, thank you on behalf of Professor Carroll, on behalf of myself, the Bond and Botus Law Offices. Thank you for participating today. God bless all of you, and I hope that you have a good week, and we'll see you next week. God bless. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.